Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about AI and the Ministry of Truth, or the history of truth, depending on how you look at that. And this is, I believe, the 13th in our series on AI and its evolution and its relationship with people. And so the Ministry of Truth is a concept that comes from the book 1984 by George Orwell. And the main character in the movie or in the book, his job is he works for the Ministry of Truth. And it's a propaganda ministry. And this book was written in the time of World War II and fascism and the Guernica painting of the war in Spain with the fascists taking over in Spain. The author of the book actually went and fought in that war. And that was also part of the inspiration of the 1984 book. And the architecture of the time was, I'm sure there's an architect name for it, but brutalist architecture, and a little bit, especially the Soviet fascist type of look was heavy and strong. And the Ministry of Truth was to arbitrate what was true and what was not for propaganda purposes. And other countries still have this today, essentially propaganda media type things, in that the US launched one last year that hasn't engaged for some reason, but it's basically the government's hand in regulating what's true and what's not, and what's appropriate to say and what's not, and censorship and promotion that can end up badly. But it's misusing the word truth to be correct speech. And it's a story of that time, the World War II fascist democracy competing time, but it's still applicable today, in that many countries have propaganda ministries of truth and so forth. And AI is going to have a big impact on these things, because in the past ministries of truth, people had to listen to what was being said and then intervene to try and change it. And now the AIs are smart enough that they can monitor things that are being said on a much broader scale and either promote or censor things that don't fit with the algorithm for the Ministry of Truth. And so in some ways, Twitter, now X, and Facebook and other social media, YouTube and so forth, have things that are allowed and things that are not allowed. The same is true of books, especially books in libraries and schools, the things that are allowed to be there and the things that are not. And they're usually painted around the term truth. And this is misused in many ways, from what people think of telling the truth, or what's the truth about something, as if it's a fact. But it can be misused as, for example, the Bible is the truth, or things that clearly have changed in 2,000 years can't be both true in the past and true in the present. There's a misunderstanding of that word. And then the religious right has adopted the word truth, where Trump's social media is called Truth Social, and other religious fundamentalists tend to use the word truth as what they're saying, and everything else is not truth. And so in the 1984 story, the Ministry of Truth had propaganda that would change the names of words. And so when you see organizations changing the meaning of words, that's like a first alert sign, where, redefining war as peace, or freedom as slavery, or ignorance as bliss, or things that clearly are trying to recode the language to affect the understanding of the population. And we'll talk a little bit about where does this come from. And it's a normal human thing, but it can go too far. And so that this is a problem that AI maybe can make better by checking of what's being said, which it isn't doing very good in the generative AI right now, but it's improving. But it also can make it much, much worse and more pervasive in your text messages and your phone calls and your social media posts and so forth.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary.
So that was the introductory ad for when Apple introduced the Macintosh computer, and their adversary at the time was IBM computer, and IBM had the reputation of being the authority in computing and centralized and controlled, and large corporations like IBM and the rebellious individuals wanted similar sort of power. And Apple's target was to target that crowd of rebellious creatives and their fight essentially with the totalitarian large corporate control, and thus the theme of sort of Macintosh versus corporate. And then we've talked previously about what is truth and how does society monitor that and how does the information come forward. And so there's, in this history of humans' inventions, grandmothers, we've talked about it as being the keepers of the memory of the culture and language and how to survive better and how they help their offspring survive better. And so grandmothers are essentially not only your biological grandmother, but in a cultural group, it's the collective wisdom of the group. And I pick grandmothers over grandfathers because they do hold a slightly different pole in the hunting gathering, where while the men are out hunting, the grandmas and women are gathering and comparing notes as to how to best survive. And then the next invention that came after that, I would say, is fire, where individual human by themselves is prey, but two or more humans together who cooperate become predators. And so the evolutionary leap of going from an individual to a cooperative community was a major thing in terms of the evolution of humans and human society, that allowed humans to survive better as a group or as a community than they can on their own, and expand to where we've gotten to today. And so fire, not only, of course, you can cook your food and heat your living space, but it also is the early stages of things you can use to communicate at a distance. And obvious in this, smoke signals, where the communities far apart from each other could send limited signals from one to the other using signals that evolved into Morse code, that evolved into binary, that evolved into the communications across electricity and later the internet. And that's the information that the AI evaluates to make decisions. And so this technology is continuing, as we've talked about it in other videos, but the kind of in-person communication scales, where there's this concept of the town crier as a European concept, but somebody whose job it was, before newspapers, before books, before printing really, was to walk through the town square and recite the news of the day, whatever the king or the government wanted recited, but the technology was basic human language and human voice, and sometimes they carried scrolls, but the idea was to refine information somewhat centrally, compare it with the grandmothers, and then the news would be spread to the population in general. And there were two categories: the news, which was fresh and new, and then the wisdom, which is more or less handled by religion, which has worked well for several thousand years, but it's starting to fray as far as it being accurate and able to keep up with the changing pace of knowledge and information. And the truth gets blurred in between these, like how much of it is religion and how much of it is news that's fresh but not tested, and what is truth in that sense. And so the religions of most major religions that have spread have a sacred texts, sutras or Qurans or Bibles or things of this nature, which they condense down to say this is the debug tested best way to survive and the rules to best survive in society. And the religion, each religion would say their version of that is the truth, and all the other truths are wrong. And then science came along to say, let's check some of these assumptions. So as mentioned before, that when you add error checking to religion, you essentially get scientific thought or what the governments base their understanding of truth. And so there's many different religions, and they've all evolved from something before. And the sort of logical conundrum is, if this particular version of the Holy Scripture from this year in this subgroup is correct, and all the other ones are either correct also, which would be an agnostic view, or all the other ones are wrong and only one is true. And the reality lies somewhere in between, that they each have things that are right and things that are wrong, but there's no one that is the definitive truth, even though they'll use terms like it's the Word of God, who wrote this particular draft in English language, the latest version of the scripture for whatever religion. And so it's not logical, but religions aren't logical. And a disciplined agnostic would say all religions are equally valid and true. And if you want to put the word true in there, but having two conflicting things, logically, they can't both be true. But for the people who believe that, it is. And so if you want to navigate through society, you have to assume that people believe what they're saying and think is true. But that word is problematic. And so as these different kinds of views of religion and spirituality have evolved, the concept of many gods, and then the Greek gods and the Roman gods and these kind of things have evolved, where what's taken over is among the more aggressive, forceful kinds of religions that emphasize a truth around survival, but it's a little bit more survival of their particular set of memes for that religion. And one of the ways they do that is by having lots of rules around breeding, because the best way to have a religion survive is to breed more practitioners in the religion. And so the rules in Muslim or Hindu or Christianity or Judaism are very detailed around behaviors that might lead to adding more people to the religion, because they're brought up that way, as opposed to they've evaluated the religion critically and they want to join it because they think it's right. It's more that their parents told them this is what's right. And many of these religions, if you don't agree, they kill you or they push you out. And so religions and the concept of God are evolving, where we've gone from natural phenomenon like the sun to hybrid animal people to people in the sky to people walking on earth that get their instructions from the sky, to preachers who say, give me money so I can tell you what that guy, the dead guy, said that he learned from the guy in the sky. And so these tend not to adapt their rules to a changing ecosystem and changing technology. And so they're running out of gas and at risk of a reboot. And one possible new candidate would be money as God, or the internet as God, or a search engine as God. This cartoon shows money as a choice, where people are shifting their respect for something divine to something a little bit more tangible in a way, but less anthropomorphic. And so most people in most countries view money as important, maybe more important than religion in their life. And so these kind of things for different governments in different parts of the world, the historical tradition of religion and churches as being a source of truth is separated from the government and the state and the science-backed error checking of the religion that shows that the rules in the religion or in the scripture or whatever are often incorrect. And so you can't make life or death decisions generally about the running of a government if it's purely a religion, although many governments are. Iran, religious fundamentalists, for example, or say the Christian right or Christian nationalists in the US want this, where the church sets the truth for the way government is run. And this is okay if it's right, but increasingly it's incorrect based on assumptions that are out of date. And some religions are adapting Buddhism, for example. The Dalai Lama says, if science discovers something that is inconsistent with the way Buddhism views it, then Buddhism must change, not the science. Where some of the battles in other countries is if science discovers something that is inconsistent with the way the religion teaches about it, then the scientists should be punished or ignored, or the government should be ignored. And so this was a problem for even the Romans, and they realized, and as more modern governments were set up, having a state that works on more up-to-date rules that are adapted to new information or error checking runs the daily operations, and the principles and guidance from the church are largely valid. So you can have both. It's just which one decides disputes. And so they create a wall between church and state. And the US Constitution is originally structured on this kind of thing. But there's a constant battle, like, for example, on the money, the US money, it says, "In God we trust." But it hasn't always said that. In fact, it's only said that on US money since 1958. And so there was 200 years before that where God was not in the Bible, it was not on the money, it was in the Bible, it wasn't in the Constitution. And so these kind of things, the fundamentalist conservatives, religious conservatives, want the church rules, even though they're 2,000 years old, written in Aramaic, as we talk about in other discussions, that they're not necessarily accurate or correct or true with modern technology. And so navigating this church and state separation and how society is run is under duress. And so the way that people have evolved to evaluate these kind of things is originally as individuals, like packs of wolves or flocks of birds or other kind of communal type organisms or species, are urges like, are we hungry or not? Or do we need something to change, like our location? That drove a lot of our behavior. And then, as we've talked about, senses evolved, hearing and seeing and feeling and other stuff. And so what to do to survive better and to reproduce better was driven largely internally from our urges and our senses. And then in many species, the sense of family, where the offspring are reared by the parents or the family community, is something that help people survive better. And creatures that, for example, lay eggs tend to have less family involvement in terms of educating the offspring to thrive. But as the family helps each other survive better, the likelihood of those offspring surviving to be able to reproduce themselves is higher than people working only on their senses and urges. And then this sort of evolution of elders or grandmothers allows the information to be accumulated over a longer time span. And so slower changing information like crops and climate and agricultural type things can be transferred through the elders that aren't necessarily biologically related, but because of the rules around breeding, they tend to be highly biologically related. And so there's natural selection, Darwinian, Richard Dawkins force that has them survive better if they have some genes in the game. Like your offspring might have only half your personal genes, but that's more than somebody who isn't your offspring. And then this concept of Big Brother that's used in the 1984 book as the authority of the government, church combined in a fascist sort of way, like in Spain or Italy or China, is that the government becomes a nanny state and religion that sets the rules about survival. And that's worked better than pure religions in some cases, but not as well as democracies in terms of ability to thrive as a kind of species entity. And then there's the news as mentioned, where how does new information get integrated in, and then how is older information retained? And so beyond what the grandmas can remember is writing and printing that lasts longer but is less agile and less adaptable. And then the church as a vehicle to convey that information beyond what the family can do. So this is an evolution of more and more information over longer periods of time, over wider areas of reach. And so essential in this was writing, which is a few thousand years old, and then the printing press, which is only 500 years old, that allowed writing into things that could be reproduced reliably and could be made portable, that would be able to be accurate and consistent across distances and across time, written down across time and then portable across distances. And so books and libraries are this information extracted from the people into language that then persists for longer. And the problem with this is the Library of Alexandria burning, where the libraries concentrated both for religious purposes and for government purposes and for refining the knowledge. But this is a centralized vulnerability that can burn down all of it, and sometimes caused by somebody who wants to break the system, and others just accidents. And so, as I mentioned before, the kind of the family, the biologically related people that becomes a tribe, starts to education system of the new generation learning from the prior generations by doing how to survive better. And this has become very important with agriculture, which you have to remember things across longer time scales as the climate changes, El Niños and droughts and floods and famine and pestilence, all those kind of things, that you can write them down. But if you don't error check them, then what you've written down is wrong. And so you have to continuously update this to have good information that's worthy of survival. So this is how education became an important part to participate in the tribe or in the society. And religion has done a lot of education, which is not teaching you facts or details. It's more integrating you into a way of surviving and thinking. And these different ways are like different species. So there's like the dog's religion and the cat's religion, and they're both valid, but they're somewhat incompatible. And this is, people are integrated into that through education in school. And that you can try and reject education, but if you do, then you're rejected from society. You're playing meaningful roles in society if you don't at least know what is trying to be communicated. And so this concept of the resistance being futile, where that to participate in society, you have to participate in the education. And some people call that indoctrination. Some people call it brainwashing. Most people have problems that they see in it, but it's the way that society runs. And this is starting to become automated with the internet, in that when you want to use a service, education or entertainment, you have to opt in to the terms of the service. And the terms of the service are not really very negotiable. And you have to, if you want to participate in YouTube, for example, you have to agree to abide by YouTube's rules and even learn about them, be educated about them. Otherwise, you're rejected. And so that's the trend, the government side of teaching the truth with error checking, as opposed to teaching the truth from scripture. And so the government runs K through 12 education, which previously was run by religion, and before that was run by families and tribes. And the library books are things, not just the books themselves, but the anthologies or the collections of books that create the wisdom of, usually from a point of view. Like you pick a language, like French, and so then the books in the library are mostly in French, and they're a slower changing collection of information that's basically rules to survive and rules to breed and thrive. And then with the error checking of science, you get journals which put forth the thought for now and how they arrived at that thought, and then encourage other writers to test their assumptions and reproduce or find a different result to what's written in the journal. And so this is the scientific literature in the journals, which is a little faster moving than books. And then how do you communicate that to a broader group? Or media is something that is more effective than that. And that's really only the last 100 years with things like radio and TV and the internet and so forth. And then how do you further slice and dice this with dictionaries? Like, what is the meaning of words? And these change from time to time, and some change rapidly. There's like the urban dictionaries that describe the meaning for different words that might be in the popular media, where no existing word quite does communicate the idea as well. And so defining that, and encyclopedias tell you a bit more how to do things. And so this is a hierarchy of the evolution of this kind of information, still all using older technologies. And as we've talked about overall, is the role of AI in this is the past, which is all these things we've just talked about, evaluating them in the present to decide what to do about the future. And so the history has all these useful things in it and errors in it. The action, the computation of deciding what to do based on the history is dependent on how accurate, or I won't use the word true, but how useful the information is in the history. And with better computation, you can try different scenarios and see which one best fits the data. But the first approximation is it's going to be fiction if it hasn't been tested. And so this is how AI is functioning, where it has memory, it can compute on it, and it can now forecast into the future. And whether that's a hallucination or erroneous based on wrong assumptions or wrong computation, has to be tested. Like, how do we plant the crops, or how do we best choose who to breed with, or these kind of things. So it's an iterative process that isn't static. And so using a word like truth usually is wrong. That it's based on inaccurate information or wrong computation, and predicting something that might be a hallucination, or some of the problems that AIs are having now. And going from data into fiction is part of the problem, but error checking the fiction is also an important part, and communicating it accurately. And books, a 500-year-old technology, have been getting cheaper and cheaper to make. Before the printing press, they were hand scribed, but the technologies, many different technologies, have made them cheaper, more reliable to produce and distribute. And so like a typical book is in the, say, $10,000 to $20,000 range to produce and distribute each. But they might have been 100 times that cost years ago, and the technology has improved that. But what books don't do is change rapidly, and they're not interactive much. And so this is something that's changing the speed with which books can keep up, but other technologies are much faster already. And so these sort of digital technologies, in this hierarchical sense, is how do you distribute these things globally quickly, which is essentially the internet and different kinds of media distribution. But then how do you improve faster than can be done by re-editing and reissuing books? Things like the encyclopedia, where Wikipedia is not only using the tools of the internet to update the encyclopedia type information, they're decentralizing it, in that the people who write Wikipedia and improve it It's called crowdsource, and it's been shown with experiments scientifically that the crowd will get a more accurate, more reliable, maybe more truthful assessment of some phenomenon than an editor at a publishing house who printed a book that can't be updated quickly or has a bias. And then Google, you can, it's more like a reference search that searches everything, including the mainstream press and the obscure press. And then Mathematica is like Google, but it also it's been around for almost 20 years, I think. But it has more computational capability, where if you search for 2 + 2, it knows that it should give you back 4. And that's a little bit more like the AIs of now. And then social networks, they're very much like a crowdsource of news, but with different opinions. And these are the things that have been fed into the language that ChatGPTs or large language model generative AIs have started to appear. But their foundation is fraught with errors and reasons why they can't give the truth back. That they can give lots of choices of the truth, but it doesn't really know unless it checks it. And so a scientific large language model that checks the things that reports back using evidence will be better. And of course, it will come. And then there's a whole nother level of things like Amazon, which connect the idea of information to the physical reality, where like I have this idea of a pair of shoes, and Google will show you a picture of the pair of shoes, but Amazon will send you the shoes, and with not much extra work. And so that's a merger from the digital into the physical, or bits into atoms for the information. And so these things have a different way of interacting, where Google's a bit more of a reference kind of relationship, and in some ways similar to large language model chat, but a chat is more like a relationship where you're having a conversation with somebody. And so the way you go about searching these two different things is a little bit like you might one go into a library, whereas the other you have a relationship, an ongoing relationship with people. And Google has a tracker that's, now says, would you like to continue your journey of the last time 5 years ago where you booked an airline ticket for somewhere? It remembers that and helps you to maintain the relationship over years in what you were searching for at the time. But a relationship like a chatbot is a little bit more human, personal, where like a mentor or a guide. And so some of the other innovations that have happened is this concept of peer review, which is a bit like a Wikipedia, or with a crowd of people reviewing the edit, which is a little better than one centralized editor who may or may not know the edits that they're doing. But when you have 2 or more who are also credentialed or educated in the topic that's being edited, you can get a bit more of a crowdsource and thus a more accurate kind of assessment of something before it's published. And then the physical costs of editors and publishing things restricts how broadly they can be used. And so the government acts as the editor for some of these things, where it's the Ministry of Propaganda or Truth is being run by the government as opposed to the church. And then science is error checking on that. And then because of the technology, the costs have come down. There's now millions of books instead of 1, and there's now millions of channels instead of 3. And so the choices are expanding. But one of the deficiencies is the costs are covered by advertising. And the advertising model for publishing and media and so forth is not, the motivating factors are not to reveal the truth. It's to get more attention, to have people see more ads, to get more money. And so the business model of media, truth, and information is perverted by advertising. And I might toss in sort of evangelicals or the church financial model of is shifted to be a bit more advertising and entertainment, where people participate in church, and which is mainly a sales pitch about why you should give that particular church on that particular minister more money. And so both the media advertising and religious advertising is diverging away from revealing the truth, because the incentives are to collect money, not to reveal truth. And so the money moving into being the central motivator is some of the things are also controlled by money. So education, like what's in education or whether you can access education or even scientific journals is controlled by money, as is media, like what's in the mainstream media getting mass distribution, whether that's Fox or Twitter or CNN, is a function of money. But on those kind of channels, their motivation is to sell advertising. And then when it comes to justice and government, whoever can afford the best lawyers tends to do better in a dispute, and whoever can fund the politicians that have their view tends to adjust the law. And now there's even issues in the US with the Supreme Court, who's supposed to be objective. There's all kinds of scandal and bribery or influence money going into the Supreme Court. So money is becoming the central driving force of, well, what is true and what's not. Ricky Gervais was talking about, is it more important to be popular or correct? And that in this post-truth society that's emerging, people have gotten to ignore the evidence and the credentials and the research of opposing ideas, and the loudest, most aggressive ideas weighted equally with the well-researched, thoughtful idea, and that the people are just looking at the emotional relationship between the people debating and assume that they have equal ability to answer the question. And this is leading to other kinds of problems. So that's where I'll end with the slides.